Okay, well, welcome and thanks to all for joining this town hall. I'm Melody French, one of the moderators and a co-chair for the Faulting and Earthquake Cycles Working Group. Today, we want to provide you with an update on some of the plans we've been working on for the field geology and experimental components of the Faulting and Earthquake Cycle Working Group in SZ4D. And we also want to get your input on how we can improve or better develop these plans. I'm going to start with a brief description of SZ4D and our role within it. SZ4D, as many of you know, is a research coordination network, or RCN, funded by NSF. The goal of the RCN is to develop a plan for a science initiative to understand the basic science underlying subductions and hazards. The activities of this RCN have been that the RCN has been supporting as we develop this plan includes working groups, workshops, webinars on related science, and town halls where we seek direct feedback from the science community like you. The hazard focus and the science that we are pursuing in SZ4D emerged from a community workshop in Boise, Idaho, and SZ4D was also highlighted by the National Academy's Decadal Report for 2020-2030. Within SZ4D, there are 3 working groups that are developing science goals and defining a science program. These are the Faulting and Earthquake Cycles Working Group, the Magmatic Drivers of Eruption Working Group, and the Landscapes and Seascapes Working Group. One current focus of SZ4D is identifying and developing the processes and science goals that link these 3 working groups together. So that while we're representing today the Faulting and Earthquake Cycles Working Group, hopefully you see synergies with the other working group, and we encourage you to feel free to point them out and emphasize them, particularly if your research crosses boundaries between the groups. You can sign up and be part of any of these working groups at our website, and we hope that you'll do that. I also wanted to mention here our 4th and newest working group, the Building Equity and Capacity in Geosciences Working Group. The goal of this working group is, in their own words, to transform the mindset of our geoscience community to embrace education, outreach, capacity building, diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice as critically important for the success of the scientific endeavors. Within SZ4D, then their charge is to identify the correct set of activities in pursuit of their goals that are strategically useful and maximize the specific assets of SZ4D, including the links to geohazards in our international partners, instrumentation, and multi-institutional collaborations. You can sign up to be part of this working group as well, or this interest group at our website.
Okay, my name is Christine Regala. I'm one of the working group members for the Faulting and Earthquake Cycles Working Group. And so today we are focusing on one of these sub-working groups within SZ4D, the Faulting and Earthquake Cycles Working Group. And this working group is made of numerous representatives from the community that span a broad range of disciplinary expertise. It's important to note that while today in this session, we are representing the Faulting and Earthquakes group, many in our community have research interests that also fall under other working groups. And similarly, many of the activities we're going to discuss today have overlap with other working groups. And we're working on gathering feedback from all of you on how do we formalize those interactions. And so what exactly are our goals? What does this SZ4D Research Coordination Network, RCN, need to do? Well, in summary, we need to design a program to build our science that is collaborative and community-centered and has explicit integration across the subduction system and across subdisciplines. And these 2 bullet points are vital components of SZ4D because it is becoming increasingly apparent that researching and actually understanding the processes that underlie subduction hazards requires large amounts of data from multiple well-characterized sites, from an incredibly diverse range of disciplines that spans timescales from seconds to millennia and spatial scales from microns to kilometers. No single PI or single discipline can do all of that on their own. And so SZ4D is an opportunity to enable the science that we can't do on our own. SZ4D is an opportunity to build mechanisms that accelerate the pace at which we can make new discoveries by bringing all of your incredible minds together on common critical tasks, and by inbuilding mechanisms to make the data and the science widely accessible and usable across fields so that we all benefit. SZ4D also needs to have a balance between community level and PI level work. So we need to be able to provide specific deliverables that achieve common sets of data needs and goals, not just in faulting and earthquakes group, but across the broad spectrum of SZ4D. And so this means sometimes collecting data that serves other disciplines and researchers in addition to furthering your own work. But SZ4D also needs to respect and value the creativity and discovery and individuality of individual researchers, so that researchers have opportunities to continue to do their amazing work and have space for their ideas and discoveries to impact how the program and how the science evolves. So exactly where SZ4D will lie in the spectrum of community level versus individual level science is still being discussed. But because community level projects in field geosciences and experimental geosciences is typically less common, in today's workshop, we want to spend time discussing what successful community level geoscience projects could look like and what scientific gains we could make in this sort of model. On the more nuts and bolts side of things, another way to think about SZ4D is that we want to develop a vision or maybe even a prompt for funding that provides what we need to successfully address our research questions and that addresses limitations in our current working models that are inhibiting progress. Okay, so what have we been doing? So where have we been? So far, the working group members have been working on these tasks. So first we needed to identify the main driving science questions, and we took these from the 2017 Community SZ4D Initiative report and amalgamated these to find the common driving themes and also to identify questions that are actually answerable. Next, we needed to evaluate what data and activities are actually needed to answer these questions. And these data and activities span the geologic, experimental, geophysical, and modeling disciplines. And then we need to link these data and activities back to the science questions, make sure they can actually answer the questions. And we did this through a couple of ways. One was using a traceability matrix. And you may have seen these in previous reports, these big Excel sheets, but we are using these internally to evaluate the detailed what, where, and why of our activities and how they link back to our science questions. And we've also been working on the development of generic experiments and activities that help us understand, well, physically, where would we put a measurement or an instrument that can actually help us obtain these goals? Finally, we needed to start to understand what subduction zones, both modern and ancient, can we actually study to address these questions? Because not every subduction zone has the attributes necessary to actually answer these questions. So we started by defining subduction zone attributes required to answer the scientific questions, and then have been developing subduction zone inventories of which attributes these zones have to inform our decision making. Okay, so where are we going next? Well, some of the next things that we need to do are prioritize data needs and refine plans for experiments and activities, develop inventories and attributes for onshore analog field sites, and we need to consider what models for SZ4D organizational structure might actually benefit us. We need to develop and strengthen international partnerships. And we need to work on integration across SZ4D components. All of these elements require community engagement and feedback. And so it's important to know that one of those modes is this town hall, but we're also going to be sending out surveys after this town hall because we're going to need specific volunteers and feedback on specific items as we move forward on this progress this summer. Okay, so now I want to review our science questions that the faulting and earthquakes subduction group has been focusing on. So our first question addresses the critical interactions of the lower plate, upper plate, and plate interface components of the subduction system. And that question is, how are the subduction system evolution and structure regulated by the upper plate, outer rise, and slab faulting and associated deformation? And so this is a broad spectrum question that includes things, for example, such as how slip on one fault in the system impacts the likelihood of slip along other faults in the system. This is a process observed in several subduction zones that leads to cascading hazards, such as triggered upper plate earthquakes in populated coastal regions. But it also includes processes such as how do outer rise faulting impact hydration status of the subducting plate and ultimately alter fluid pressure and fluid migration paths from the mantle wedge to the plate interface to the overriding plate. Our next three questions then focus on specific components of the subduction system that are important for hazards. So our question 2 is, what controls the speed and mode of slip in space and time? So this involves developing mechanistic understandings of where, when, and particular why a fault may experience slip across the range of known modes, from seismogenic slip to slow slip to tremor and creep. Our third question is, does distinctive precursory slip or distinctive foreshocks exist before earthquakes? What causes either foreshocks or precursory slip? And this deals with understanding the transient processes that may occur before slip events. Our fourth question, under what physical conditions and by what processes will rapid slip during an earthquake displace the seafloor and increase the likelihood of generating significant tsunami? And this includes understanding the physical, chemical, and dynamic conditions that lead to the initiation and propagation of tsunamigenic slip, and is motivated in part by our growing recognition that tsunamigenic slip can occur by a variety of modes and can occur not just on the plate interface, but also on outer rise and upper plate faults. So this question is intrinsically linked and overlaps with questions 1 and 2. So next I'm going to hand this over to Daniel to discuss the roles of the geology and experimental communities in these efforts.
Thanks, Christine. So my name is Daniel Viete. I'm part of the Faulting and Earthquake Cycles working group. And today I'm going to provide some information on the reason why we're all here today, details on the geological and experimental activities within FEC SZ4D. So these activities are to address the how and why of the driving questions that Christine just presented. And we just want to make clear that, well, first of all, answering these questions requires coordination among different disciplines, using different measurements and hypothesis testing in collaboration with modelers and geophysicists. And so it's important first that these activities have a common set of goals and are collaborative at their core. But as Christine mentioned earlier, we also want to respect and value creativity, discovery, and individuality. And so one of the challenges is developing a program which does both. So within FEC, the geological and experimental activities in FEC, we have broken the activities into 3 different categories. So the first is geology and paleoseismology work on active systems, tectonically active systems. And these primarily address the first of the 4 driving questions and the last, the tsunami question. The second set of activities involve exhumed sites as analogs for active fault zones and upper plate regions within the subduction zone. And then the third involves an experimental network doing deformation experiments. So today we're going to present some early stage plans and ideas, and we're looking for some feedback from you, the community, at the broader scale that we can use during planning. The town hall will involve some breakout sessions that will facilitate that, and afterwards there will be a survey sent, as Christine mentioned. So the first of these activities involves active system geology and paleoseismology. And as I said, it's geared towards answering this system scale question, question 1, and also addressing question 4 relating to tsunami. So the way that we've structured this program, or at least we're looking for feedback on our early plans to structure this program, first using community sites to gather people within the geology and experimental areas in very specific points for onshore studies of active systems to study the hazards and provide context to the instrumented work being done by the geophysicists and the seismologists. So this includes focus on upper plate geologic hazards, records of seismicity and deformation on the thousands to million year timescales, crustal structure and physical properties of the upper plate, and it would be, as I mentioned, coordinated with instrumented sites. And our current thinking is the way to reach out and make this interdisciplinary is to have common themes of which we're looking at. And so these are properties and processes that are studied as part of a more interdisciplinary set of work which is centered around some common themes. So some of these would include potentially the roles of triggering of hazards in the upper plate, energy budgets, which is a strong focus of the landscapes and seascapes working group in SZ4D, fluid pathways and the movement of material, and stress state and implications for volcanism, which would reach out to the MDE working group. So eventually we'll need community input on these specific sub-questions that we're using to branch out interdisciplinarily. So the second set of activities look at older records, exhumed records, and these are designed to study processes and material properties at depth to answer not only question one, the system scale question, but also more specific questions about mode and speed of slip on faults within the subduction zone network. So the network, there will be a network of sites linked to the research questions and coordinated with instrumentation. And what we're looking at in this case is time integrated records from the Phanerozoic that are exhumed, from which we can extract information about the processes that occur at depth. We will look to span the full range of pressure temperature conditions that occur in subduction zones from the surface to the mantle. And we'll look at both the plate boundary, the interface region, and the upper plate. And with these activities are opportunities for community education and, of course, to generate samples for experimental work, to obtain samples. And again, so part of the process is reaching out to other disciplines by gathering around some emerging themes. And so this may include structure and heterogeneity of the subduction system and the interface region, particularly in terms of length scales of this heterogeneity in the nature and the materials involved. Lithologic, pressure, temperature, and constitutive variations with depth in the subduction zone and the response to these changes, fluid flow and its relation to reactive transport, and also the generation of overpressure, and of course, upper plate structure and strength. And so, yeah, we will also need community input from these sub-questions. So this is a working plan, and part of today is getting feedback from you all. And so in terms of the proposed community site model, there will need to be a process for selecting these sites. And this will be a process applied for both the exhumed analog work and the active site selection work. And it needs to be defensible and rigorous. And so it will involve, we propose first, developing an inventory of sites and creating a list of required and desired attributes. We also need to consider logistics and access and such things. And then we'll also evaluate synergy with the activities of different disciplines within FEC and also within other working groups within SZ4D. And again, we're going to seek community input in this. So now I'll pass back to Melody to talk about experimental activities.
Thanks, Daniel. The third community plan is for a laboratory network that we have outlined based on experimental rock deformation and physics community needs and the anticipated SZ4D program needs. Over the past decade, the experimental community has outlined their needs in reports from the Advancing Experimental Rock Deformation Research Workshop and the Experimental Studies and Subduction Zone Science Workshop. Both expressed a need for resources to support the physical and human infrastructure of our laboratories to help keep them modern and safe, including for technical support. There is also an expressed need in these reports to increase the accessibility of laboratory research to students for training or to people without home laboratories, either because they are not primarily experimentalists or possibly because of the great cost and time associated with setting up a lab. In addition, given the collaborative community nature of SZ4D, where experimentalists work closely with field geologists, modelers, and geophysicists to answer specific questions, then there will be a need within SZ4D to collect critical data as determined through collaboration of these communities, but without compromising creativity. So keeping these needs of the two communities in mind, we've developed the framework for a plan in response to these needs, and we would like your feedback on it today in the breakout sessions. We propose a network of laboratories. To join that network, a lab would either commit to agreeing to host outside users at their facilities. We propose that the duration and the timing of the visits would be completely set by the PI, and that an annual proposal process could be used to match visitors with hosts to collaborate on SC4D science. Alternatively, or in addition, the lab could commit to collecting data that is critical for SC4D science. And to be clear, given the collaborative nature of SC4D, the lab network PIs would be involved in decisions that prioritize science. So this is not meant to be prescriptive. Such experiments could be done on samples from the community field sites or other materials that have been deemed important by the community. As a result of these commitments, network laboratories would have access to certain resources that include funding to maintain and upgrade equipment to do SC4D science, and financial support for the staff, postdocs, or students who help with the visitors and/or the collection of the critical data. The amount of financial support we anticipate should scale with the level of commitment from individual labs. They would also receive priority access to SC4D samples and resources for other independent research. Labs within the network would be supported by community staff who would oversee the logistics of coordinating that network, but it could also consult on instrument modification, design, and repair, and the development of the technical aspects of proposal budgets. I want to be clear that such a network model does not preclude the involvement of deformation laboratories in SC4D through other avenues, including PI design research. There are other considerations for the experimental community that we would like feedback on in the breakouts and in the survey. Among them is whether this model would be helpful in other laboratory communities, including the analog experimental community, as well as the best avenue for including our international colleagues. The SC4D RCN ends this coming November, and by that time we hope to have a plan for how geologic and experimental community studies fit within SC4D to answer the 4 science driving questions. This will not be a granular science plan, but will provide a roadmap and structure for the next steps, which could occur at multiple funding scales and which we should be prepared for to occur at multiple funding scales. Our goals by November are to frame plans for the geologic and experimental community initiatives. And for that, we really need to get your feedback during the breakouts on the 3 community initiatives we outlined in today's breakout sessions and in the survey. On a more logistical side, and to be consistent with SC4D decision-making process, we need to create a list of possible community exhumed analog sites. And we'll be asking for volunteers to help us with this in the survey we send out after the town hall. Similarly, we need a list of properties that the community sites must possess to answer the science questions. And we'll be asking for volunteers for this in the survey as well. With this information, we as a community can then identify a short list of potential candidate sites and be ready for the next steps. In the future, but not immediately, it will be important for the community to identify priority themes and measurements that are required to answer the driving questions so that we are sure to make room for them in the planning process. And finally, it's not clear right now how SC4D will be executed, but it is to our advantage to identify what we can do at different scales, including with the funding options currently available to us. So we would like to create a list of immediate resource needs and the opportunities that we have to pursue them. And that will be part of our breakout discussion at the end today. So today we would like your feedback on the community infrastructure and resource needs, including whether these plan meets the needs of your communities and what we need to do to make these plans successful. Along that vein, ideas that have been put forth by the community so far and that we hope to expand upon or add to include the need for human infrastructure, including staff to assist us, as well as students, internship programs, and coordinated postdoc programs, sabbatical programs. Physical infrastructure that has been brought forth by the community includes the need for sample storage and distribution, community field supplies, laboratory infrastructure, investment in instrument design, and offshore and onshore drilling. Data infrastructure needs that have been mentioned include storage and management across disciplines. So we will be asking what we need to be successful and how we can get started now, meaning at the end of the RCN. So for the rest of the town hall today, we've set aside a few minutes for a Q&A in case you have general questions about the SC4D or the RCN. And then we'll have 3 20-minute breakout sessions. So you all will be randomly assigned to 3 breakout groups, and you'll stay in those groups for 60 minutes. But the 3 of us, or 3 different discussions, will occur, and we will cycle through those groups. There'll be one discussion lasting 20 minutes on community field sites, one discussion lasting 20 minutes on experimental network, and one discussion lasting 20 minutes on the community building and infrastructure needs. So you all stay put, and the 3 of us will cycle through. At the end, then we'll return to the group, take a quick 5-minute break so we can synthesize the discussions, and then we will present them back to you. At the very end, we'll leave about 15 minutes to have an informal discussion on immediate needs and opportunities. So with that, I want to open it up. Christine, perhaps if you could moderate, to any questions that you have on the general structure of the plans or the RCN or SZ4D. If there are no questions, we can move straight to our breakout rooms.
There have been some questions in the chat about specifically about timescales for selecting analog systems. I don't know if that's a discussion that we want to address here as we're together as an entire group or within the breakout sessions of the community field sites.
That sounds like a great breakout question.
Yeah, there's a second set of breakouts that will be specific to discipline, and one will be exhumed systems, and that's maybe a place that we can discuss that. All right. So thank you everyone for all your feedback. There was tons of suggestions, really good information in the field activities breakout. I'm going to start with a couple of quotes. So the first breakout, one of the first comments was, "We've been doing PI-driven science for 100 years. Maybe we're going to try something different." And then in the second breakout, it was suggested that community sites may allow breakthroughs, the breakthroughs necessary to annihilate a problem, and that's the quote, simply by sheer volume of data. So for the example that was given is that, drill core can allow you to inspect a sequence at the centimeter scale in incredible detail. And so this is an advantage that may be gained from community sites. And in general, from the buy-ins, there was, from the breakouts, there was broad buy-in for community sites with some suggestions as to how this could go ahead. First of all, it was suggested that it would be good to have some flexibility to change, swap, drop, pick up sites as it becomes more apparent what information is needed and what information is available, and as scientific questions may change. So flexibility is key. And another thing that was brought up is that it would be good to go to more than one place. Just because one place shows a process or a feature doesn't mean that that process or feature is universal. So basically using multiple sites to explore things more globally and universally. Another interesting thing that was brought up is an idea of, I didn't finish writing this point, but what I meant to say is active and exhumed sites together. So an idea that, some of the exhumed rocks that give us perspective on the deeper histories may ultimately be brought through the upper plate and record some of the processes associated with the active system. And so it may be possible to go to the one place and extract information from multiple locations in the subduction zone as they're recorded through time. So overprinting may be an advantage. Recording multiple processes in time and space that can be extracted, from which information can be extracted. There was less focus on community research themes because we didn't get to the discussion with as much time, but it was said that these are just as important as community sites and need to be a key part of the program. And it was also brought up that there are advantages to co-location with geophysics activities and seismology, and in particular for the upper plate and active site geology. And another thing that was brought up is that effective data and sample sharing is going to be key here, and it requires intention. So in order for everyone to be studying the one system, people need to be able to share what they're finding and share the samples that they're taking. And then there was also a suggestion that funding needs to see activities through to their completion. There was some suggestions that in previous programs, things were half done. And so there needs to be some planning in that sense. All right, so that's a summary of some of the points that were brought up in the field activities discussion. Thanks for everyone who got involved.
Thanks, Daniel. I also have an incomplete list of everything that was discussed. So just again, a reminder that we'll be sending out the survey. So if you don't think that you were heard or that your point is summarized here, you can reiterate in the survey. We are listening. It's a lot of information to process, or I just might not have put it on the slide. But some of the things that came out of the discussions on the experimental activities, I guess I would summarize with saying there seemed to be a general support for having a network model, because it would provide a transparent means of collaboration and would also break down barriers to involvement in laboratory research. But there were a number of issues we discussed that would have to be carefully considered in terms of how that network model was actually executed. Some of those issues were particularly related to the use of deformation laboratories, and that is that experiments and collaborations can occur on a wide range of timescales. So collaborations from weeks to months, and so that any model for a network would have to take into consideration those very different timescales of collaborations. And potentially one avenue is finding ways to fund multiple visits or longer term collaborations, as well as potentially shorter term collaborations in labs that supported those. There was an express need to fund personnel who would be spending time with those visitors, and different discussions about the best way to do that. So we'll have to consider that carefully. And this is a long-standing discussion in our field. But maybe the thought that the funding should definitely scale with the time commitment, and potentially included through the outside visitor proposals, at least if in instances where outside visitors were involved. And also there was a suggestion that longer, more permanent technicians were funded through NSF, as is currently done, for a limited number of laboratories. There was a comment that partial supporting of a technical support will require cobbling together multiple funding sources, but of course that's something we do already right now. So that's something we're sort of used to. Suggestions for funding mechanisms specifically for graduate student training and postdoc support, so perhaps fellowship opportunities through SZ4D through there. Better need to keep inventory of labs and capabilities and to make that accessible to the community, so we better know what our options are in terms of interlab collaboration. And another suggestion that came up was that we might want to prioritize the type of measurements that we need at an SZ4D level. This sort of network right now is quite broad. And suggestions that we learn from different programs that have already exist, and how we can sort of leverage those approaches, like the AGES program and Beamline and synchrotron scheduling and technical support. There were a number of different, not listed on the slide, but a number of different other communities that might benefit from this model, and we should certainly consider how to reach out to them and get that feedback. So for instance, the geochronology community and the modeling community might also both benefit from this kind of model, and an express need that we didn't really get too much to technical advancements. We actually might have that opportunity a bit more in the very last 15 minutes. But at some point, our community really needs to think about what sort of infrastructure needs we have related to SZ4D and how we can implement those now. And Christine, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks. Yeah, we've had some really great discussions about kind of big picture community building and infrastructure needs, and how what we want and how that might actually evolve. And so there were multiple ideas, but I tried to kind of break them down into 3 categories. So again, apologies if your ideas haven't made it here, please join our discussion at the end, and please respond. Again, a lot of data to come through. But first, there seemed to be general support of the idea for community sample archives to break down barriers in terms of the time and the resources needed to collect samples, but also to try and help get context and measurement that individual PIs may not be able to do on their own. But there were some really important things to consider, and like, if we did this, how did we actually make this work? And so one thing that kept coming up is that if we have a sample archive, we need large volumes of rock, both for current research and future research. And so how do we do that? It's time and resource intensive, and we need people and resources and facilities to manage that. And so another question that came up is, well, do we collect it all now, or do we do it in stages in terms of volume? A suggestion was that we think about the prioritized questions within SZ4D that would need samples and start there and build our archive through time. A second point on this was that such an archive facility needs to be accessible to everyone. Again, there were some comments that some past sample archiving was a little bit closed, and it was difficult for community and members in general who were maybe not directly involved with the sampling or directly involved with the project. It was difficult for people to access these samples, and that cannot be a model that we go with. There was strong support that these samples need to be easily accessible to communities, but also that this repository has to live on past SZ4D. This has to live on in perpetuity. And so all of this is a big commitment, time, resources, money. In terms of what we would need in addition to the samples, we have to have really good contextual data and metadata, and there's lots of different needs there that would need to be balanced. And there's a lot of existing resources that we can leverage in terms of places that are already doing sample archival and distribution and working on collecting these metadata and contextual data. And these might meet a lot of our needs to get started on this endeavor. The second was that there was support for the ideas of community research stations paired with our field and analog research sites. And so some things to consider with that sort of model is that these stations need to be physically close to the areas you want to work in. And so if we have a network of sites, as has come up a number of times, the suggestion is that we need a multiple set of field stations perhaps. Another idea that came up was, are there other logistical technical needs that we can provide? There was a discussion of, in the Aleutian Islands, of researchers being provided through the Geoprisms program with ships and location, or ways to get from island to island. And so we're thinking about the correlative for that on land. Is it a network of fleet vehicles that can get us from place to place? Is that actually something that can help us? Because a lot of our universities are taking those away. And at these field stations, we can use this as a way to rally support in community and integration and interdisciplinary work. So we can have kickoff parties and education sessions to help foster interdisciplinary collaboration, have multiple teams who may be working geographically in the same area to start at the same time and actually start to talk to each other. So we can start to have this collaboration opportunities and knowledge transfer from the start. And then have wrap-up meetings at the end where we're also sharing ideas that we could, again, utilize these field stations as an example of what we have learned from some of these locations. And the third point, this is kind of a catch-all that came up in a lot of different ways, but we need to make sure that integration and accessibility is built throughout the process. There was some discussion that some past similar community efforts have made it difficult to access community samples, or it was unclear how new researchers could join these existing efforts. And so we need to make sure we inbuild ways to bring in a diverse community into our projects. And part of that is that we need to include the financial resources on all participants to make sure that that can actually happen. So that's the summary that I was going to present.
Awesome, thanks, Christine. So we were actually just going to end with an informal discussion about immediate needs and activities. So if you want to stick around for that discussion, we were going to break it into 3 different informal discussions for about, I guess we have about 10 minutes now until the hour. So if you want to join one of these breakout groups and talk about either active system geology, the exhumed analog systems geology, or experimental network and infrastructure, then head on over. Otherwise, thank you for joining. Thank you very much. And again, survey for feedback coming out. So please provide any additional information that you'd like to. Here we are. Thank you, everybody. Again, I mentioned again, we're going to send out a survey, so fill them out. Volunteer opportunities for geology and sites and for experimental feedback and volunteering. So thank you for your feedback today.